So Maya Allen is our third speaker joining us for our Roots of Dry Farming in the Western U.S. panel. So Maya, if you want to go ahead and share your screen, I can introduce you while we're getting set up. Great. All right, so Maya's passion for plants and algae have taken her across the southern United States to Alabama, Arizona, and then back to her home state where she is currently pursuing her PhD at the University of New Mexico, focusing on how plants cope with environmental heterogeneity. Ms. Allen has also researched the history of Blackdom, which is the first all-Black settlement in the state of New Mexico, in an effort to rectify the erasure of the Black botanical contributions and highlight the Black botanical experience. Ms. Allen continues this advocacy as one of the co-founders of Black Botanist Week, and we're going to share that in the chat box, the link, which is a social media campaign that promotes, encourages, creates a safe space for, and finds more Black people who love plants. So Maya, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing the story of dry farming in Blackdom.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you to the Dry Farming Institute for this wonderful invitation to present at your Dry Farming Collaborative meeting. I'm so happy to be here and be able to share Freedom Through Dryland Farming, the story of New Mexico's first Black settlement, Blackdom. Blackdom, as the name implies, was an all-Black town in southeastern New Mexico in the early 1900s, and this community of about 300 residents really held education at their core, and they used dryland farming as a mechanism for freedom. So Blackdom was about sovereignty. It was about cultivating a safe space for Black people to thrive economically, for Black children to grow up empowered and without the oppression of Jim Crow laws and white violence. And this haven they created would not have been possible without the botanical relationships these people had and without dryland farming. These people moved to an entirely new environment, and so they were going to have to learn this new land for survival. And these lands are traditional Mescalero Apache lands. And so this is the traditional homelands in this map, which was the entire southeastern corner of what we now call New Mexico. And it's really imperative that we acknowledge the intimate relationship held by Indigenous people with these lands. Like, they were the original dry farmers and still are. And Blackdom residents are going to capitalize on the Homestead Act, which was enacted in 1862 with the goal of increasing access for poor people to land. So the federal government previously sold land to generally wealthy people, and the Homestead Act was really to give access to poorer people. But the Homestead Act directly contributed to colonization. So it's really important that we recognize that this resulted in the settlement of 270 million acres, and it displaced many Native American peoples from their lands. And although the people of Blackdom were trying to cultivate a utopia, it's still important that we don't contribute to erasure of colonization and genocide. So Blackdom was incorporated in 1903, 16 miles south of Roswell, New Mexico. And so Roswell is going to be that larger town to the north, and then Artesia is to the south. So Blackdom's right here. And then to the right, this map shows all of the Blackdom land patents. And so here, this red star is Ella Boyer's patents, and you will learn a little bit more about her later, but she's gonna own a significant portion of Blackdom's land, and she's gonna be really foundational for the leadership in Blackdom. So Blackdom's story begins with the journey west in 1900, and we're gonna see this timeline again. And then we did have the founding of a town site company before the actual settlement of Blackdom. And this beginning starts with Frank Boyer and Daniel Keyes departing from Georgia and walking to New Mexico in the year 1900. And Frank Boyer is really the visionary for Blackdom. There's a couple of different narratives to how this idea came about. But Frank Boyer was a 24th Infantry Buffalo soldier and became familiar with what we now call New Mexico during his military service, and saw the lands and saw that New Mexico didn't have Jim Crow laws to the same extent as the South. And so Blackdom had been a vision that had been brewing for a long time. And so Ella Boyer, his wife, and their children moved to New Mexico the following year in 1901. And they're going to homestead in Dexter, New Mexico, which is very close to where Blackdom will be located. And this is going to serve as their trial period, essentially, where they're going to learn to dryland farm and learn more about the land. And ultimately, Frank Boyer is going to become the president of the Blackdom Townsite Company. And Ella Boyer, like going back to that map I showed earlier, she's going to file a desert land claim under the Enlarged Homestead Act, and she's going to own quite a bit of land in Blackdom. And then ultimately, when Blackdom is experiencing its largest period of growth, people are moving there and having established buildings and all kinds of things, Frank and Ella Boyer are going to be two of the three board members in 1911. So they're going to be the majority of the leadership during that time. And really, the tenets that this family has are going to be reflected in how the town is developed and also what we see in the Articles of Incorporation. So with homesteading, you have some startup costs. You have that $500 for that filing fee, and then you need the money in order to fulfill the requirements. So you have to improve the land in some way, like either by building a dwelling or by planting crops. And so we do see a bit of lag between the actual settlement from the company. So the company is going to come first. And so Frank Boyer and 12 other Black men formed the Blackdom Townsite Company in 1903 with a punitive capitalization of $10,000. And a couple of things I want to highlight from the incorporation articles is that they were intentional. They were going to maintain this colony by cultivating crops. They wanted to establish a system of education. Frank and Ella were both college educated people, and education was really important in this town. And then they also wanted to improve and upbuild the moral and mental condition of the colony. And the town of Blackdom is going to be established around 1908, and it'll ultimately be abandoned about 1928. But in order to have a town, you need to have people. So now that they had this company, they had a targeted advertisement campaign, and they were trying to convince people to move to Blackdom. And so here's an example of one of those ads where they're really asking for farmers, because we saw that in the articles, that this is going to be rooted in agriculture. That's how we're going to sustain this community. But you also needed some other professions. We care about education. So they were going to advertise that we need teachers. And then we also, just a fun tidbit, is George Malone, the first Black lawyer in New Mexico to argue in front of the Supreme Court. He moved to Blackdom from Tennessee in response to one of these ads. And so in this campaign, you're seeing that all of these things are collating together, where you have this intentional name, like, it's called Blackdom. So there's no like misunderstanding about what this is about. And this campaign was really successful. So we did have people answering that call, and we had a lot of people who were coming to Blackdom. Most were going to be former sharecroppers from the South, but we did have, teachers and lawyers and some other people as well. And in moving, right, you're coming from the southeastern part of the United States. You're coming from places with high precipitation levels, and you're encountering this, where this is Blackdom today. And then this is what it looked like about the 1900s, where you had Black Grama, Bootalua, Iriapota dominated grasslands with soap tree yuccas, Yucca elata. And so they're going to have to navigate this new environment. And their livelihood was centered on agriculture. So you need to have success in that area. So how do you do that? And the answer was dryland farming. And so this is typically practiced in areas that have high rainfall during a wet season. And then this is often in winter, but depends on what part of the country you're in. And then you cultivate your crops during the dry season. And so they're going to have to do some new things here, like having wider than normal spacing so that each plant has that good bank of moisture to draw upon. You'll have to have community involvement for strict weed control because we don't want those weeds taking up that moisture from the soil. And then you'll also need to have minimal tilling of the land relative to the south because we don't want to expose those soils to moisture loss. And so here, this is really going to take a communal effort in order to be successful. And Blackdom is 4 kilometers away from the Pecos River. And so they don't have the option to irrigate. They don't have permanent surface water. They're going to be reliant on precipitation. And the great thing about New Mexico is that we get a summer monsoon season. So that's a great supplement during the hottest part of the year to the winter soil moisture from the snowfall. And how that happens is what you have increased solar radiation because our earth is tilted towards the sun during summer. And so that takes a while, right? Because our lands don't heat up right away. So around July, this land is really hot. And then you have that warm air rising. So we have low pressure right above the land surface. Whereas in the ocean, it's still cooler because water has a much higher heat capacity than land. So it doesn't warm up as fast. And so since there's this high pressure over the ocean, this air is going to move towards that low pressure. Then our water condenses and boom, we get summer monsoons. But when we look at the precipitation data, which is on the y-axis, across the years that Blackdom's being cultivated, we see we have really annual precipitation. Our temperature is pretty consistent. That's the colors. And then this blue line is what we require to have dryland farming, like very, very successful dryland farming in New Mexico. So as we're moving into Blackdom, so we had the establishment of the company around 1903. We have a really good year in 1905. And the nice thing about our soils is that they can retain some of this moisture to buffer when we have bad years. And that soil is loam. And that's also great for agriculture, as you all know. So loam is that perfect combination of sand, silt, and clay, where you have the sand that's the larger particles, and they allow for drainage and aeration. And then you have that clay that's nutrient rich and smaller, more compact. And then our silt just brings everything together and helps it mix well. And so this is going to be great. And you'll see this in the advertisements too. Like here we have the climate is delightful and the soil rich and productive. They're talking about these loamy soils because they strike that perfect balance of being able to drain well, but also retain that water. And so some of the crops that they were growing in Blackdom, alfalfa, right? So Frank Boyer, during his time, that trial period in Dexter, New Mexico, he actually had the largest hay harvest business in Dexter. And so he was learning the ins and outs of growing hay and harvesting it. And so this was all going to be built upon when they actually get to Blackdom. And alfalfa, or Medicago sativa, that's the scientific name, is really well adapted to drought. So for one, we know that there is artesian water in the Pecos Valley, but digging those wells were very expensive. It was about $4,000, but alfalfa can grow deep roots to reach that groundwater. So they can go up to about 20 feet. So you don't need to make that monetary investment if you have a crop that does this naturally. And then also, this hay loves well-drained soil. It doesn't like to have its roots sitting in water. And so that's perfectly paired with the loam. Some other things that they were growing in Blackdom was corn and cantaloupes and onions and sugar beets and tomatoes and lettuce here in the background. But because that precipitation was so variable, you really had to be intentional with the quantity that you were growing, but then also what crops you were selecting to be grown in this arid environment. And a couple of things I want to highlight about what was being grown in Blackdom is that apples were one of the first crops that they grew. And this kept coming up is that they had this community orchard and they shared in the labor and in the fruits of that labor. And I was like, wow, you pick up and move across the country and plant apples. So this was certainly a dedication, because apple trees can take up to 3 years before they bear fruit. And so these people were in it for the long haul, and they were really, really dedicated. And it was great because Roswell, that northern city, was also experiencing a boom. And so people, when they're coming in, they want treats like fruits. So there was a monetary component to it as well. And then the other thing that people of Blackdom were capitalizing on was the growth of golden wax beans. So Frank Boyer, the president, one, he leveraged that position, but also that he was having success with this particular crop in order to obtain a water pump. So he was writing this company, and he mentions this in this letter, that, hey, I've got this successful crop and business. You've got the water pump. So let's work together. And sorghum bicolor is going to be the last crop that I discuss. Crutcher Eubank was a farmer in Kentucky that moved to Blackdom, and he homesteaded in Blackdom in 1906. And he was growing this crop in Kentucky. And this crop especially is going to be really well suited for the arid Southwest. It's one of the most drought resistant crops, and it also has a long legacy with African peoples because this dryland cultivar was cultivated in Africa. So some of the wonderful properties is that it has a large root to leaf surface area ratio. When it's in drought, it can actually roll its leaves to lessen water loss, and its leaves have a waxy cuticle. So that also helps with water loss. And then it'll go dormant. If the drought is just too much, instead of dying, it'll just go dormant. So there was a lot of properties about this crop that were excellent for the Pecos Valley in New Mexico. And sorghum bicolor was actually introduced to the Americas by enslaved African people. And we have data and research that shows it's been grown in subsistence plots. So the plots that people use to only grow their own food by enslaved people. So really rich history being exhibited here in New Mexico too. And these farmers of Blackdom are going to be invited to the National Negro Farmers Congress in Birmingham, Alabama. So it's you move from the Southeast, you come to New Mexico, and then you return to the Southeast to share your knowledge with your community of what you're learning and this tie of the community together through farming. And it's so impactful that we stem from a legacy of farmers, but unfortunately, there are far less Black farmers today than in 1920. During the time of Blackdom. So in the 1920s, there was about 14% of American farmers were Black, so about 1 million at that time, but now it's 1.4%. So about 50,000 of our farmers are Black. And that really has stemmed from Black farmers receiving only about 1/3 or less of what their white farmer counterparts have received, and those discriminatory lending practices. And so now we're seeing a resurgence of people wanting to reconnect with these agricultural roots in the Black community, which is wonderful to see. At the height of Blackdom, which was around, from 1908, when we're seeing settlement through 1912, 1913, Blackdom residents are going to get a post office. This little town has their own post office. And then they had a store, a church, an office building. And there's some variation in the number of residents at the height of Blackdom. I'm going to go with 300 based on census records, but I've seen from 150 all the way to 800 reported. And so just to return to this, we had a wonderful targeted campaign for people to move here. We had people settling, and then we get a post office. Now, from 1912 to 1919, we're going to have a lot of challenges that the Blackdom community faces. And ultimately, by 1928, we're going to see Blackdom is abandoned. One of those challenges was the drought of 1916. So we see a severe reduction in precipitation. It's a relatively warm year because it's yellow. And we are, what is this, like 2 inches of rainfall in a year. This is going to be devastating to Blackdom. And water here, although artesian waters were found, and that's kind of why we were seeing that boom in Roswell, it was expensive. It was about $4,000. And by this time, there had been too many wells dug in the Pecos Valley. And so a new law was passed banning new artesian wells from being constructed. Because ultimately what happened is that there was so many wells that the water table dropped. And so our soils were now becoming more alkaline. And then that was affecting crop production within the Pecos Valley. If that wasn't enough, in 1916, there was a worm infestation. So Blackdom lost their community orchard. And that's been mentioned quite a bit that in my research in newspapers and in articles, is that this was symbolic to the community. So that was really devastating for them to lose their apple crops in their orchard. In 1917, we saw World War I, excuse me. And so in Roswell, there was a military institute there. And so you had an increase in job opportunities in Roswell. So you had a lot of Blackdom residents leaving because of this combination of drought, of worm infestations, and then you also have increased economic activity. And then you also had several of Blackdom's men being drafted. So you're reducing the actual number of people in Blackdom as well. So what do? You have a severe drought. Your soils are very alkaline. You've lost your apple orchard, and now you're losing some of the people. So what Blackdom residents did is they pulled their land together and formed the Blackdom Oil Company in 1919. And so this drought-stricken sandy land was more valuable pulled together because it increased the probability of finding oil. And there was a big oil boom in New Mexico at this time. And so they leased these tracts of land to major developers in New York and in California. But what was really helpful financially was when they contracted with the National Exploration Company. And that was worth about $70,000 or about $1 million in today's money. And so this really gave Blackdom residents the financial freedom to move to places like Albuquerque, where I'm at now, like the big cities, or Las Cruces. And it would be helpful for Frank and Ella Boyer. They're going to move to Vado, New Mexico, which, you know, they could actually irrigate in that environment and have a successful township there. It was not going to last forever. I mean, our oil prices collapsed during the Great Depression in the 1930s, and we ultimately see Blackdom abandoned around the Great Depression, about 1928. It's a slow trickling out of people during this time. And if you look at the newspaper articles from that time, a lot of them describe it as Blackdom being a failed social experiment. They read almost like they were excited about Blackdom's failure, but Blackdom wasn't a failure. It's now abandoned, yes, but the legacy still lives on through the story and through the descendants. And it shows that through community, we can achieve freedom and we can build a home. Dryland farming helped these people ultimately gain financial freedom. And they shared knowledge, they labored together to cultivate their community orchard, and they persevered in the midst of drought. And at the final end of it, they innovated in order to maintain their livelihood. And many of those things we're doing here today. We're coming together to share knowledge and to build community in this meeting. And that is really the take-home message of Blackdom. So there's my citations. And with that, I will take questions.
Thank you so much, Maya. So Tegan has been compiling questions for you, and I hand it over to you, Tegan.
Yes, Maya, thank you so much. So much gratitude. Your enthusiasm and love for this topic just radiates. So we so appreciate you sharing this amazing story and history with us. So one question that came in is, Maya, how can modern farmers learn from Blackdom's community farming and land pooling? Thousands of acres are handed down by generational farm.
Tegan, I lost you.
Yeah, Tegan's frozen. I think she got bumped off a minute ago. Maybe we'll just give her pause for a moment. Yeah, I think I don't have the questions in front of me, but it was about kind of the pooling of land and like lessons learned that maybe could be applicable today. Maybe if you have anything to speak to that, we could give her a moment to rejoin.
Sure. So ultimately, Blackdom is certainly a story of resilience. And when we look at that temperature and precipitation data, that is super variable in the 1900s. So unfortunately, with climate models for southeastern New Mexico, we're anticipating that we have increased temperature and that we have more variable precipitation during through winter and through summer. So we really don't know what's on the horizon. So I think in terms of resilience, it is very impactful that these people were able to innovate and come up with the idea of forming an oil company. But there is so much we as humans can do before the environment is going to decide it for us. So I think it's important that we consider taking actionable steps to mitigate climate change and have people in leadership that will do that. And then also that we go to bat for our fellow farmers and for our ranchers, because they're the ones that are going to be really impacted. Well, everyone will be, but their livelihoods are going to be really impacted by climate change. And so you saw that community, that sense of community for one. I mean, you're organizing all of these people who spent all of this time investing in improving the land to pull it together. And then we're all just going to believe that we're going to split this money evenly based on who pulled the land. So, right, there's that trust there and there's that sense of community. And I think us being in this space and developing that and sharing knowledge is really, really important and something that we can certainly continue on from Blackdom.
Mm-hmm. So Tegan wasn't able to rejoin, but I think Matt, I have somebody submitted a question to me, but if you have some questions that Tegan was gathering for Maya, maybe you could go ahead and communicate those.
Yeah, I do not have those questions, but definitely people send questions to me, and then I'm on. So
okay,
why don't we let you go first, Amy, with your question?
Yeah, sounds good. So there's a comment and a question, Maya. So I'm very concerned about the low numbers of Black farmers today. You said there is a lot of interest in reversing this. Can you say more about what work is being done to help? What are the major barriers and needs?
Yeah, so there was a lawsuit in 1999 against the USDA because of those discriminatory lendings. And there was a settlement, but unfortunately, a lot of those settlement funds didn't actually reach the people that were like most profoundly impacted. There is a new piece of legislation. What's it called? This was in Albuquerque. Oh, wait, you guys are in Oregon. What's it called? So there's a new act called the Justice for Black Farmers Act. And it looks like it's been introduced in November. And this is supposed to help have some protections in place for Black farmers, and then also provide some land grants and the USDA, there's some position in the USDA that has not been rehired yet that used to exist. And then the person, I don't know if they retired or what happened, but they have not filled that position. And it's like the USDA civil rights type position. So that position needs to be filled. So maybe having pressure from the community to actually have someone fulfill that role, and then having support for the Farmers Act too would be great. Additionally, there's a lot of, like, in the field of academia, there's a lot of wonderful researchers. Monica White, she was at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, but I don't know if she's still there. She's been doing a lot about freedom farming and telling these stories about how this is manifesting in cities now. So when you had that transition out of the South and you had a lot of migration to cities, how has that manifested? So her work is really impactful too. And I can send some more things to Amy and Tegan too, to send out too, like smaller nonprofits that are great to support.
Great, thank you, Maya. Let's see, Matt, have you had questions come in on your end? I think Tegan is back as well.
Yeah, so I got one question. It's a little, I don't quite know. So sorghum, collards. I think the question is kind of getting at, like, is there any sort of knowledge that you have about what's the word, like those sort of multi-crop systems? You know, like, are there any sort of plant synergies between different crops that were, you know, either traditionally grown in Black agriculture or that might have been grown in Blackdom?
Yeah, I don't know about synergies, like for like things that were grown in tandem because either they could fix nitrogen or do something like that. That I'm not as familiar with. But I mean, sorghum was really impactful because of its legacy in Africa, and the same thing with with rice, right? So we've had a lot of times the narrative is that, you know, Black people were brought to this country for just labor, but there was also this distribution of peoples who had this botanical knowledge. So you had a lot of West Africans that were brought to the Carolinas specifically to grow rice. Because of those different rice cultivars that had been domesticated in West Africa. And so there was also this knowledge component about which crops were being grown when you were thinking about slavery within America, but then also like within the Americas. So that knowledge is there. A great book to read would be In the Shadow of Slavery. Let me grab it. This is a good book to read that talks about that. Judith Carney does a lot of research in this, and she wrote this book. It's more geared towards like the Southern Hemisphere, but there is stuff about North America too. So in the show, it's hard to talk into. So I'll put that in the chat.
All right, well, I hope that answers your question. While you're putting that in, another question that I got is, what is the current status of Blackdom? Who owns the land? Is it like a public park? You know, is it some cattle ranch or something? Like, what's going on there now?
That's a great question. So Blackdom now, it's really interesting because there's been several families that have come to the Southeastern Historical Society and say, we still own the land. And there's like 160 acres that one family still has. And then I forgot the other family, how much land they own, but some of the land has still been retained by the descendants of the original peoples that were there. Blackdom right now, all there is that historical marker that I had in the background when we were talking about the black grandma grass. There was a big, there was a push to have what was it? It was like a memorial park in Roswell, New Mexico, because that's where people actually still live. No one lives in Blackdom. There's nothing out there. I don't even think there's a road out there anymore. And so they were going to do that. But what happened is that funding ran out, and then just different, and then it kind of just fell by the wayside with our politicians too. So there has to be someone that would support bringing that to the table, and then also funding too. So, but all of the architectural plans have been drawn up, but it never got off the ground.
So the next question, these are some big questions, is about like the Homestead Act, and maybe, sort of how maybe white settlers were able to access the Homestead Act as a tool, and USDA loan programs were as compared to Black farmers and settlers. Do you have any answers to that question, or?
So I don't know of any discrimination in actual homesteading. From what I would assume, his assumption is that Black people were able to access the Homestead Act fairly easily, because we saw Black settlements in Kansas and Oklahoma and Texas. So we see multiple events that would illustrate that. Now, in terms of the USDA, those, like, I don't want to say workshops, but like information and loans and subsidies, those have been documented as being discriminatory. And so that's a big reason why we had George Washington Carver go to Tuskegee, is because there was a need for the communication of agricultural practices, like rooted in science, but also just generally to record what people were doing. And so he did a lot of that work while he was at Tuskegee, and really reaching Black farmers and communicating these techniques.
Hey there, just chiming in, apologizing to everybody. And as I am one of the timekeepers, unfortunately, we we're at time, but there's one question just to wrap up. And that is, are there any guided or self-guided tours available for Blackdom?
No, I'm sorry, there's not. There, I will send a few websites that are really great, like modules of like the Homestead Act, and like they have pictures and stuff. And I'll send, there's a couple of them that are pretty good, but it's a little bit, it's not the same, but it's something that you could use. Yeah.
Well, thank you. What an amazing presentation.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and I'm so curious, Maya. So you spoke to your research on the history of Blackdom and dryland farming, and you have this whole other area of like botanical research. And you meant it's Maya's full bio is on our website. So kind of characteristic. I would love to chat sometime, or maybe have you back to talk about kind of the characteristics of plants that lend themselves to being drought resilient and phenotypic plasticity and things like that. So maybe we can geek out about that another time.
I would love that. That's great.
Yeah.
Yes, I'd be happy. Yes.
Awesome. Me too.